I did all this work when I was at the University of Newcastle, and I just want to thank my supervisor, Jeff Evans, from Newcastle, but I've now moved to UTS. Yeah. So I'm talking now about unconventional oil, and we'll have a bit of fun. I hope. Keep that close to you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I work now at the Institute for Sustainable Futures. We're a little bit alternative. We're kind of what you get when you cross a consultancy firm with a university. So we have PhD students, master students, but we don't have a teaching load. We don't have the ability to sort of do research for the sake of doing research. We have to do research that's paid for, essentially. So it's small-term energy utility, government-type research that we do. Okay, so now let's get into it. Let's have a bit of an introduction. Let's slip through this. But we're going to have two definitions. Not too painful, I swear. Then we're going to go into the current situation, just have a look at what's actually happening. Then we're going to look at the modelling theory, but I swear it's only a little bit of maths, and it really is fun. So, just bear with me. It'll all be picture-rated, so, it'll be no equations, I promise. Don't be too panicky about that. Then there'll be the URR estimates that we used. The URR is, generally speaking, the most sensitive input into all the models, so it's always one to focus on. And then you get the pretty projections and all the pretty graphs that come from that, and that was your little conclusion. Okay, so a couple of definitions. First up, natural bitumen, Canada tar sands is a classic example. Denser than water, very, very viscous. Extra heavy oil, very, very similar, and it's a Venezuela stuff. It's just slightly less viscous. And shale oil, or no real definition, but for the purpose of this, let's just consider it as being kerogen-rich rocks. And you can either burn it or convert it. Okay, now the fun ones. The URR. The URR is just all the historic production plus all the future production. And the way I like to think of it is, imagine that you have a time machine, and you simply go into your time machine, go forward 1,000 years, stop, and look at what the whole, and obviously then hopefully all the oil production stopped, and then you can just go, okay, all the historic production was X, then that's what the URR was. So it is, in my mind, a fixed, rigid number, because at some point in time we'll have a point in the world where there just isn't any more production, so it's fixed. But of course, we don't particularly know what that fixed number is. That's why I use a bunch of different numbers. And the other one is exploitable URR, and that's used for the model. And it's basically just the entire URR of the region minus the URR in mines that have not yet been produced. The other way of thinking about it is that the exploitable URR is the URR in the mines that you've already put online. So if you like the exploitable URR, when you put the first mine online, the exploitable URR is the URR in that mine. When you put the last, and it keeps growing as you put more and more mines on, and when you put the last mine online, then the exploitable URR becomes the URR of the region. Okay, so let's have a little look-see at the current situation and have a bit of fun. We can see pretty heavily dominated by OPEC and a little bit from the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. If you want to make a projection of conventional oil, generally speaking, very, very easy because you've got a large amount of production. It's generally speaking very easy to put a Hubbard curve to that and then get a projection. And as long as you get the URR roughly right, it should be good enough. But just look at the little purple little blob. That's all the unconventional oil production at the moment. It's very small, isn't it? And the other thing that I want to highlight in this graph is just look at it from beginning of 2005 onwards. We've been absolutely flat as a tack at about 30 gig barrels per year. You can see a tiny little blip in 2008. That was a wonderful little global financial crisis, which may or may not be little now that I'm in Europe. Sorry. So now let's just zoom in on the purple patch. Okay. So we can see, roughly speaking, about 2/3 of it is Canada, 1/3 is Venezuela. And if you've got very sharp eyes, and I don't particularly do, but if you just zoom in, you can just see a little bit of green. That's all the shale oil production. It's nothing. It's less than nothing. It's a tiny little drop in a bucket sort of thing. So how do we want to project these sort of fuels? It's going to be very, very difficult. We want to use something like a Hubbard curve. You just can't chuck a Hubbard curve, plonk it onto that data, and then project it, when that's maybe the 1%. It's not going to work. So we need to create a bit of a more interesting model and to be using assumptions in the model which can at least be more arguable, if you like. Be a little bit more transparent, and from that generate the model. Okay, so I just want to highlight the differences in production. A typical oil field in the North Sea, and on the other side, the Canada tar sands. So that's basically just a really large pipe dug into the hole. Pretty simple. That is one of the biggest mines of anything, anywhere. The tailings dam is one of the biggest tailings dams in the world. Vastly, vastly different types of production. And I just want to ram this really home to you guys. This is the UK oil production by individual fields. Now, what you can see, there are two take-home messages from this. The first thing is that the size of the fields go from big to small. Why is that? That's very simple. Because, well, for starters, it's easy to find the bigger ones than it is to find the smaller ones. And for seconders, when you have, right at the beginning, you don't have any infrastructure in that area. You have to actually get all that infrastructure made. So you want to do that on something that's got a very large amount of oil there to actually justify the expense to actually bring it online. So you start it in that way. So you go from the big ones, which have large amount of reserves. You can justify all the amount of infrastructure that's needed, and then later on you can put on smaller ones because there's much less infrastructure that's needed for them. The second point to make from this graph is the shape of the fields. Sharply rises up, plateaus, decays. That's it. Now let's look at unconventional oil. And we see vastly different. We see the production from an individual mine or in situ plant is flat. If you want the production to increase in the region, there are two options. One, you upgrade the facilities, and that's what you can see in some of these. Or alternatively, you put more fields, put more mines or in situ plants online. So there's two ways to increase the production. Okay. So just to hammer it, I guess, we assume two distinct forms in the model. So for conventional oil, we assume the weird shape over there. For a mine, for unconventional oil, we're assuming the trapezium. So from now on, just think of it always as being a pretty trapezium that we're putting online. Okay, so we're taking these trapeziums and we're going to create a model from them somehow. First thing is it's iterative. Okay, so for each individual year, we do something, then we go on to the next year. We know from a technology function, which I'll get to in a couple of slides' time, we know the size of the mines that we're going to be putting online. So the size of the trapeziums. And we get, so now the question is, how many mines do we put online? That answer comes from the cumulative production, which we use to calculate an exploitable URR, which we then use to put the number of mines online. So it's a little bit convoluted, but it'll make sense a little bit later. And then we just go on to the next year and keep going until we basically, have put all the production online. Okay, so we ideally have these trapeziums, but of course in reality they don't look like that. They look more like that. So what happens is the model says, okay, supply and demand's really, really tight, upgrade the facility. Oh, yeah, never mind. Demand was very, very, no need to have that much supply. Shut it off. Oh, yeah, probably should have had it back on again. Chuck it back on again. So that's the sort of thing that the model's doing in the background all the time, depending on what the circumstances are in the model. Okay, I mentioned a technology function. It's just a tan-h function, pretty mathematics, but all it is basically that over time, the size of the mines increase. Why do they increase? Basically because of technology. We get better at mining things. We get better at extracting the stuff, etc. And so basically what all the model is doing that. Initially, you put on the really tiny little trapezium. Then, maybe the mid-year types, you're putting on a medium-sized trapezium, and the last mine that you put online is a big trapezium. That's what I mean. Simple. Okay, so we know the size of the trapezium. How do we know how many that we put online? Well, we use the exploitable URR. So we have this wonderful little thing. Oh, sorry. This is New South Wales coal data I should be mentioning, but it's basically the same should be the same basic logic for coal as it is for unconventional oil. What you can see here is you have a cumulative production on the x-axis. Each year, obviously, you increase the cumulative production by a little bit. That, in turn, increases the exploitable URR by a little bit. And that increase in the exploitable URR has to be come about by putting on more mines online. Okay? So each year, cumulative production goes up a little bit, which means exploitable URR goes up a little bit, which means you put on a number of mines online so that that is met. And that's all the model is doing. It's actually pretty simple. Well, yeah, there's a lot of other things around the tracks, but it's vaguely that simple. And so when you put it all together, take all the values that we used, fitted to New South Wales coal data, and just apply it to New South Wales coal data, you get this wonderful shape. And it looks exactly like a Hubbard curve. Well, of course it does. Surely we know that the production does look, vaguely speaking, like a Hubbard curve. So we're not at all surprised by this. But of course, the advantage of this is that we can be putting in assumptions about the size of the mines. We can be putting in assumptions about the rate at which these mines are coming online. These are much more transparent, I think, assumptions, rather than trying to fit a Hubbard curve to maybe 1% of data, and in the case of shale oil, absolutely nothing of its production. So I think it's a bit more transparent a way of doing it. And this is actually exactly what you get when you plug in exactly the values from the previous graph. So it does match up beautifully like that. And I can assure you that I was very happy about that when that happened. Oops, sorry. Okay, so now we're going to have a quick little aside into the demand. The demand is operated by two components. Firstly, the demand is for all fossil fuels. So the demand is the population, which you can see there is expected to increase to 10 billion, and the per capita demand, which is assumed to be flat at 62 gigajoules per person. Okay. Plonk that to actual production of all fossil fuels, and you can see not too bad a fit. A little bit fast, but not too bad. Okay, so we've got this demand, we've got this supply. How do we interact them? Well, we get this, basically it's a percentage term of the difference, and we let the model do a couple of things. Obviously, we let the demand increase or decrease depending on what the interaction is telling it. We increase or decrease the number of mines we're putting online. So initially, we might have thought, from the exploitable URR sort of graph, we might have been saying we're going to put 6 mines online, but because of the demand interaction, we put in, say, 7 or 5. And alternatively, we can, and if it's really strong, we can upgrade some of the mines, as we saw before, or shut the mines off, etc. And the model's just happily doing this for each individual year. The model is completely freely available. Just go online, click it, download it. The projections that you'll be seeing in the next couple of slides is on there. So if you don't like my URL number, download it, change it, rerun it. You create your own numbers. Okay, so let's get on to the numbers now. So firstly, the natural bitumen and extra heavy oil. We can see, obviously, it's very much dominated by Canada and Venezuela, which is not at all surprising because these are the large deposits. But there is also a little bit of oil in, natural bitumen and extra heavy oil in the former Soviet Union. But realistically, quite large numbers, I think. So it's about 600 gigabarrels to about 1.3 trillion barrels. I think that's quite impressive and kind of a number. I mean, 1.3 trillion is what, about 55% of the conventional oil URR. So quite a large number, potentially, out there. Okay, chuck it into the model, get the projections. What do we see? Well, we can see, roughly speaking, about 50% of today's conventional oil production could be produced by unconventional oil at the end of this century. So we're looking at about 13, say 19 gigabarrels per year by the end of this century by unconventional oil, by natural bitumen and extra heavy oil. That's quite a substantial amount, and it's quite a rapid rate at which we're putting that online. So, quite good so far. So now let's move on to shale oil. And what we can see here is the vast bulk of it is dominated by the US. And it's the Green River one, which is in basically Colorado and Utah. And basically there's very little elsewhere, or at least at the moment. So in the low case, we assume basically that shale oil is energy for the future, and it always will be. In the best case, we're assuming that there's about 1 trillion barrels of oil, quite a large number. And in the high case, about 2.2-ish trillion. 2.2 trillion is about what the conventional oil URR is. So it's, the same order of magnitude. Very, very optimistic, I think. Now let's now make some projections of it, okay? And what we'll do is we'll be very, very optimistic. We'll assume that the vast bulk of the regions, of the countries in the field, will start their production in 2020, 8 years' time. You saw the slide a while ago. There's no production at the moment, or virtually none. So we'll assume it just grows. Okay. Obviously, the low case, there isn't any production. Best case, about 6-ish gigabarrels per year by the end of this century. And in the high case, up to about 20 gigabarrels per year by the end of this century. Now, I know what you're going to be saying. You're going to look at that graph and go, wait, what's with the Green River there? It flatlines. Why is that? Well, the reason for this is because the area is extremely water scarce. There's already issues in that region for access to water. So you can't just imagine that a mining or an in situ or whatever the actual process that will be developed there, it's going to be water dependent, and they're trying to do that in a water scarce area. So it has to be limited by water. And so that's what it's assumed. We've just assumed some very, obviously approximate numbers as to what is realistic in terms of, and very, very optimistic in terms of the water availability in that region, and then convert that into how much oil can be actually produced, and we force the model to not go above that value. And that's why we're capping it. And so I think that's a very good lesson in just highlighting that there's a vast difference between the size of the barrel and the tap, which was mentioned earlier. Okay, so let's just combine the two. And we can see we're looking at about, in the low case, it's almost about half of today's production could be met by the end of this century. In the high case, we're looking at about 35 gigabarrels per year by the end of this century, more than current production. By the end of this century, only 90 years left to rapidly ramp up this production. I think that's very optimistic. Shale oil is a start-up in 2020, very, very optimistic. But okay, let's be optimistic. Nothing wrong with that, I hope. Okay, so let's have a little tangent now and move across to conventional oil. What we can see is in the low case, well, we had our little plateau and we should have by now have been declining. Well, that hasn't happened. We're still plateauing. Okay, well, in the high case, we should have had our plateau and we should have then already been increasing. Again, that hasn't happened. But okay, I mean, I should be pointing out here, the low case is being the lowest possible that could be realistic. The high case is being as optimistic as possible. So it's, putting different hats on. And the best guess case is what basically you think is the best case. Okay? It's a number that you say, well, I'm going to assume the best possible numbers I can, and I'm going to assume the best, most likeliest thing that I think is going to actually happen. And what does that say? It says that production of conventional oil will probably start declining about 2016. Not so good, but okay. So let's see what unconventional oil can do to this, to change this. And I like this slide a lot. I do apologize. So what we can see, in the low case, unconventional oil is great. It's wonderful. It doesn't really change this whole situation for us. We're still going down. So if we're being really negative, we're being really pessimistic, we're assuming very low numbers, unconventional oil is great, it slows our descent, but at the end of the day, we're still going to crash into the ground and be rather hurt when we hit the ground. In the high case, and being very, very optimistic as to the rate at which we can bring unconventionals online, we see all we get is a very bumpy plateau for the next 100 or so years at about 30-ish gigabarrels per year. Ramps up from, goes down to about 27, goes up to about 35, but generally speaking, it's flat at about 35. Okay, that's being extremely optimistic though. Okay, in the best guess case scenario, what can we see? We can see that production declines to about 20 gigabarrels, and then flatlines to the end of the century, and then rather rapidly goes down. Not so good. We don't particularly want to do that, but okay. And so I think the big take-home message for me, at least, from this is we cannot view unconventional oil as being the wonderful saviour. We cannot assume that unconventional oil is going to be, oh, it's all right, we don't have to worry about peak oil because we've got unconventional oil, and oh, it'll be all good. You can just dump it all in, it's all the same stuff, right? What's that UN bit at the bottom of it? Ignore that bit. Utter rubbish. It makes a big difference. Just because, and you can see this very much with the US Green River, just because it's very, very large does not mean you get the production. Just because it's very, very large doesn't mean that there isn't a problem. If you want to grow your transport fuels, if you want to grow your economies, you can't use oil. There's no growth to be coming from this. Okay, so just a quick little conclusion. It's basically everything I just said. Worst case scenario, unconventional oil, it just slows our descent. Most optimistic as we can get, well, we get a plateau, but we're not going to get any growth, and the best case scenario is that we can maintain about 20 gigabarrels per year to the end of the century. So we need something else, and that's obviously for the future research, etc. So just a couple of acknowledgements. Firstly, to the Institute for Sustainable Futures, where I work, Jeff Evans for being a wonderful supervisor, and Peter Rickwood and Keith Skipper for looking over the slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I wanted to say at the start that this sort of work's obviously got a lot of importance at the moment, and the link to the plenary session, Ewan Manns, you would have seen the key diagram he had with what he thought was a realistic estimate of the resources for these unconventional sources. And as I understand it, he used your work, Steve, as the main input to that. So I would have liked Ewan to be here, but the other session stole him back again. So I'd be keen to explore that a little bit more. It's very important work, so we'll have a few questions. So we'll take Shell from here, and then Shell, and then we'll come back to Jeremy. Yep.
Hi, my name is Hugh Kelly. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm a high school teacher, and I'm going to ask a very simple question, so please forgive the simplicity. But I'm trying to effectively teach peak oil to my students. Earlier today, we heard in the famous article, The End of Cheap Oil by Campbell and Larrère from 1998, that conventional oil would peak in 2006, and indeed it did. But you're saying that conventional oil, according to your graph, is peaking in 2016, according to the best guess scenario. I'm guessing something has to do with the difference between regular oil production and deep sea production, or more aggressive types of production of conventional oil. But this is a basic question to understand peak oil for me is, have we peaked in conventional oil, or have we not? Was Hubbard right that it would be around 2000, or was he wrong? Were Campbell and Larrère right? Thanks.
Regular oil doesn't include natural gas liquids. My version of conventional oil does include natural gas liquids, so it's not the same thing. The second thing is that what we're seeing is a large plateau, and we've been in that plateau since the beginning of 2005. And when I said 2016, I mean 2016 is the year that we start going down from that plateau. So which particular year between beginning of 2005 and we start declining from this plateau is a specific peak year, to me, is pretty much irrelevant. I don't particularly see any need to go, 2009 was ever so fractionally larger than 2008, and therefore that one will be the peak year. For me, it's close enough to being saying that it's just a flat line. And that's the way I like to think of it.
Okay, yeah, we'll take Shell, and then we'll come back to Jeremy.
Thank you, Steve, for a very nice presentation. And the peaking you asked about, and I'll do a comment. We have a factor that is very political, and that is Iraq. Because if Iraq has been in an environment without a war and people was willing to do investment, then we should have reached the 85 million barrels of oil production without any problems. So just removing Saddam Hussein meant that we will never reach these numbers. So it's a plateau production because, of course the oil is in Iraq. It's something like 100 billion barrels of oil in Iraq, and that will come in production, and that means that the plateau probably will prolong. So it's not possible to say that it really should be a peak because the economical things is not working the way that we expect to do that. When it comes to unconventional things, again, it's resources and reserves, and the tap is so important. And I mean, it's really important for people to understand that that tap is a lot of money, and that money, it might not be there. And it's also, for instance, if you take in the United States, why should they produce a lot of oil to export or whatever it needs? I mean, they will try to do just for themselves. In the future, the oil-producing countries will be very selfish because they know that their future is to produce for themselves mostly. So the rest of the world that is importing oil has to change their thinking immediately. They can't rely to import oil any longer.
Jerry Gilbert from Mohr. A couple of comments, first of all. I don't think you actually defined in your presentation what you meant by unconventional, so it was sometimes a little bit difficult subsequently to argue or not argue with you. Anyway, that's something you perhaps might want to think before you give the paper again. But there were a few things you said which, as a reservoir engineer, I totally disagree with. You said that URR, by which I assume you meant ultimately recoverable reserves, you said there, you implied it was a fixed number. It's not a fixed number. It's a function of cost. It's a function of technology.
It is fixed in the sense that if you go in time, and that is what I meant by being fixed. If you go 1,000 years in time, production of oil is zero. Sure. Then that URR is fixed. It was that value.
That's an unusual definition, but okay.
But that is what
you also said that URR, you said it was a function of the number of mines. No, sorry, your number of mines was a function of URR. In fact, it's the other way around. You can change URR by changing the number of mines.
I think you're wrong there. Do you mean the exploitable URR?
Well, it was a quote. I mean, in a heterogeneous oil field, in a homogeneous oil field, recovery is not a function of number of wells. But in a heterogeneous oil field, and most oil fields are heterogeneous, recovery is a function of number of wells.
I'm saying very much here that the URR is all historic plus all future production. Exploitable URR, though, is involved with the mines. So the way of thinking about this is the exploitable URR is just more or less, you have a URR. That is then a fixed, rigid value.
How do you calculate that value?
You estimate it, and that's what I've been estimating.
Yeah, but it's a function of cost and number of wells. You didn't mention cost at all.
I think that there's some great potential learning for Steve here in your experience, Jeremy, but I think it'd be great if you two could maybe have a chat at the end. There's a lot of detailed stuff here that would be great to explore. Can I get hands in the air for people who want to raise a question, and I'll just try and choose a few to get us to the end. Just the two? Okay, so we'll go over here and then to the two at the front.
Hello, my name's Stephen Bowers. I work for Evonik Industries, probably the only industry person here. A couple of questions, really. One is, when you're talking of shale oil, are you referring to the example we were given this morning, or are you also including the shale oil which is produced from such fields as the Bakken oil field in the States, which is getting a lot of press at the present time because it's become a not insignificant amount of material? The second thing you might want to consider is that you're treating oil, and conventional oil, NGLs, unconventional oil, shale oil, as one and the same. It's not. When you get it into a refinery, it's very, very different. And there are very few refineries that can process unconventional oils, that is, the heavy materials such as the tar sands. NGLs might be useful to count, but they do nothing for the transportation fuel business because they can't really be used. You can use a limited amount of them, but they don't make diesel fuel unless you go through some very torturous and very energy-intensive steps to convert them into diesel. So we're not really comparing like with like. You cannot compare conventional oil against the unconventional oils and NGLs.
I can tell you there were 2 points there, I think. The first one is the shale oil it's the Estonian stuff, if you like. So it's not the stuff that's made the recent news. The reason for that is because these projections, etc., are actually from about 2009, before that came into the news and came prominent. The second bit, dealing with the differences between unconventional and conventional. Yes, I know that they are different, and I am trying as best as possible to treat them as different things. But at the end of the day, if all it is just a processing, that's just technology. We can process things.
It's a bit more than just... It's a lot more than just technology. I mean, bending these NGLs into diesel-type materials, which is what we need. We don't need any more gasoline molecules. We actually need diesel-type materials. And we've got a huge problem in Europe because we've got refineries configured around gasoline production and the demand is going to diesel. And in 2030, the diesel demand is going to be something like 3.5 times the gasoline demand. And that's before you've counted jet fuel. So we've got a massive problem in Europe in our refinery configuration, and nobody's talking about it. We are going to be importing more and more of our finished products from the Middle East, from Russia, from India, and they are going to be buying up oil, refining it, and selling it to us, and we're going to be absolutely held out to ransom.
Thank you very much.
Steve, if you've got a very quick answer to that, you can take it. Otherwise, we'll take the last couple here.
I do view that very much as a technology issue, though. And I do think that we can do things. We can have cars running on LPG. We can have cars running on different fuels. It's just a statement that at the moment we want this fuel or that fuel. So I do think it's very much a technology issue. And I do think that if you give people enough money and if you make an issue enough critical enough, people will come around to it. That's all I want to say about that. But I fully agree that you don't believe me on that.
No, I think these are important points to discuss, and that's why we're all here. If we can make them very quick, we'll take a couple at the front here.
Thank you. Simon Cole from ESPO Netherlands. 1st of March was the celebration of the 40-year Club of Rome. And the chairman, the secretary of the Club of Rome, Ian Johnson, pleaded for reframing the term unconventional oil to uneconomical oil. And I think he's bloody right. And not just the economics of out-of-pocket expenses, but also the economy of the environment. So, can you reframe it, or don't you like this?
In my PhD, I did assume that we would just be wanting oil regardless of any climate change or any other environmental issues. So it is very much a case of what we can do rather than what we politically want to do. So that's, yeah.
Very quickly, Steve. I don't want to put you on the spot here, but I get questions from people who say, oh, there's not a problem anymore, shale oil is going to save the day. Christophe de Margerie of Total has recently gone on, on record now as saying we no longer have a supply problem. What is the snappy answer other than just saying you're wrong?
I wish I knew. I haven't heard one yet. I haven't heard a good argument yet, unfortunately. Yeah.
Right, Rembrandt Coppola, I'm pretty sure it was Rembrandt who suggested Steve Mohr from Sydney be brought over to the conference. I think that tackling unconventionals and starting to get to grips with it is something that perhaps the ASPO conferences maybe underestimated when we were in our earlier days. And so I think it's very important that people like Steve are starting to tackle the problem with new analysis, new approaches, new ideas. It is in its early days, but it's very important that this kind of work is discussed. So I'd ask you to thank Steve for coming along and presenting his work.